The escrow officer set down her pen and turned the document slowly on the table. "I'm sorry," she said, "but there's a problem with the title." My daughter-in-law's smile disappeared. "What kind of problem?" The escrow officer cleared her throat. "The sellers listed on this contract do not have legal ownership of the property." Cassandra's chair scraped back from the table. "That's not possible." The buyers, a quiet couple from Arizona, exchanged an uneasy look. My son David reached forward and grabbed the edge of the document. "There has to be a mistake." The escrow officer shook her head. "The deed is held by a family trust. The trustee is present today." David frowned. "Present? What do you mean, present?" And that's when the door opened. Because I walked through it. And the expression on my son's face, the face I had watched grow from a child's into a man's, told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't expected me. He had never once considered that I would be there. But to understand how we arrived at that moment, you need to know what happened the spring before. And you need to know what was sold at a garage sale on a Saturday morning in April that I was never supposed to find out about. My name is Gerald Pittman. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county of Hennepin, Minnesota, and when I retired, I had enough sense to know exactly what I owned, what I owed, and what I had worked my entire adult life to protect. I am not a wealthy man, but I am a careful one. My late wife, Dorothy, used to say I was the kind of man who kept receipts for things he bought in 1987. She wasn't wrong. Dorothy passed away 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 9 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is the cruelest part of that disease, it gives you almost no time to prepare, and even less time to say everything you should have said years earlier. We had been married 41 years. I won't pretend those 41 years were perfect. No honest person pretends that about a long marriage. But they were real. And when she was gone, the house felt like a museum. Every room held something of her. The blue curtains she picked out, the small framed cross-stitch she made the winter she broke her ankle and couldn't leave the sofa. The stack of crossword puzzle books on the nightstand she never finished. For 2 years, I lived alone in that house. Our son David checked in occasionally. Phone calls, mostly. He lived 40 minutes south with his wife Cassandra and their daughter Lily, who was 12 at the time and already had more wisdom in her quiet eyes than most adults I've known. Cassandra was polite enough in those early years. Not warm, but polite. She had always kept a certain distance from Dorothy and me that I attributed to her being the type of person who simply didn't need family the way other people do. I told myself that was fine. Different people, different ways. Then David's consulting firm downsized. He came to me on a Tuesday evening in March, the kind of cold Minnesota March that makes you wonder why anyone chose to settle this far north. He sat at my kitchen table and told me they were 3 months behind on their mortgage. Cassandra had taken a pay cut at her firm. They were looking at losing the house they'd bought 4 years earlier. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I looked at my son, a man of 42, who still had the same nervous habit of pressing his thumb against the inside of his wrist when he was worried that he'd had since he was 9. And I made a decision. What David and Cassandra didn't know was that Dorothy and I had purchased a second property 11 years earlier, a small lakefront home about 20 minutes outside the city, on the eastern shore of Lake Minnetonka. We had bought it as a retirement plan, a place to eventually move into and rent out the original house for income. When Dorothy got sick, we never made that move. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to sell it, so it sat. The property was held in a revocable trust my attorney had established, a straightforward estate planning arrangement, Dorothy's name and mine. After her death, solely mine as the surviving trustee. It wasn't complicated. It was simply careful. I offered David and Cassandra the lake house. I told them they could move in, pay a modest amount each month to cover taxes and insurance, and take the time they needed to get back on their feet. I told them it had been sitting empty and that it would be good to see it used again. What I did not tell them was that it remained in the trust, that the deed had never transferred, that legally, structurally, completely, it was mine. At the time, that felt like a small detail. Family was family. I didn't imagine I would need to explain it. The first year was good, or at least it appeared to be. David seemed lighter, the way a man does when a financial weight is lifted. Cassandra seemed genuinely grateful, which surprised me a little and touched me more than I admitted. Lily started visiting me on weekends, and those Saturday mornings became the best part of my week. She was a reader. Mystery novels, mostly. She would sit in my kitchen with her book while I made pancakes, and we would talk about whatever she was reading, and for a few hours the house didn't feel empty. But things changed. They always do. It started with suggestions. Cassandra had a talent for suggestions that were really criticisms wearing a friendlier coat. The dock needs to be replaced, not a question, not a request, just a statement delivered in my direction as though I had been negligent. The guest room you stay in when you visit would make a better home office. The furniture in the living room is dated, said lightly, almost pleasantly, in the way that makes it impossible to respond without sounding defensive. I let them go. I am 67 years old. I have sat across from county commissioners and developers and men with considerably more institutional power than my daughter-in-law, and I have learned when to save my energy. Then one Saturday in April, I drove out to the lake house to return a cooler I had borrowed the previous fall. I had not called ahead. I should have, perhaps, but it had never occurred to me that calling ahead was necessary when I was visiting a property I owned. When I turned onto the gravel drive, I saw the folding tables first. Long rows of them, set up across the front yard, covered with items. Clothing, kitchen equipment, books, framed photographs. And then I saw the box near the end of the second table, the one with a handwritten cardboard sign that read $3 each. I parked. I walked over. I looked into that box. Dorothy's things. Not all of them, but enough. The small watercolor she had painted the summer we drove through Colorado. The knitted lap blanket she made during her last winter. A set of teacups with the delicate blue trim that had belonged to her mother and that Dorothy had wrapped in cloth and stored carefully every time we moved. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that a woman browsing the table picked up one of the teacups and turned it over to look at the bottom, and I had to press my hand quietly against the edge of the table to keep from saying something I couldn't take back. I set the cooler down in the driveway. I got back in my car. I drove home. That evening, I called my attorney. His name is Robert Hale. We went to the University of Minnesota together and have known each other long enough that he answers my calls on the first ring and skips the pleasantries when my voice tells him something is wrong. I told him what I had seen. I told him about the tables, the box, the teacups with the blue trim. There was a long pause on his line. "Gerald," Robert said, "have you looked at the Zillow listing?" I had not, but I did that night. The lake house was listed for sale. Price, $422,000. Listing agent, a firm out of Wayzata. Listed as a 3-bedroom, 2-bath lakefront property with original hardwood floors and a recently updated kitchen. The photos were beautiful. Cassandra had good taste in photography at least. The estimated closing window was sometime in late summer. I sat at my desk for a long time. I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. My first feeling was not anger. My first feeling was grief. Because what the listing told me, what the garage sale had already told me, was not primarily about property. It was about invisibility. Somewhere along the way, my son and his wife had stopped thinking of me as a person whose presence in this situation required acknowledgement, consultation, or even basic courtesy. I had simply ceased to factor into their plans. I was furniture. I was overhead. I was a detail to be managed. Dorothy would have seen it coming. She had a gift for reading people that I never developed. I could design a load-bearing bridge across a river, but I could not always see a load-bearing lie inside a family. I called Robert back the following morning. We talked for nearly an hour. He reviewed the trust documents and confirmed what I already knew. The property had never been transferred. The deed was held by the trust, and the listing was not legally supportable without my signature. A title search would reveal the problem immediately. Any competent escrow officer would catch it at closing. They may not know, Robert said carefully. About the trust. I know, I said. Have you told them? I looked out my kitchen window at the frozen lake 2 blocks from my house. Not yet. He was quiet for a moment. What are you waiting for? I thought about that for a long time after I hung up. The honest answer was that I was waiting for David to come to me. I was waiting for my son to pick up the phone and say, "Dad, we've been looking at the house and I want to make sure everything is in order before we move forward." I was waiting for the version of David who used to sit across from me at the kitchen table with that nervous thumb press and trust me with his problems. I was giving him the chance to remember who we were to each other. He never called. The months that followed were quiet on the surface and deeply uncomfortable underneath. I did not visit the lake house again. David called occasionally. The brief checking the box kind of calls that sons make when they are too busy or too guilty to say what is actually on their minds. Cassandra did not call at all. Lily texted me twice to tell me about books she was reading, and both times I wrote back, and both times I meant every word. The summer moved through itself the way Minnesota summers do, fast and golden, and then suddenly over. In September, Robert called to tell me the listing had been updated with a new projected closing date in early October. The buyers were a retired couple from Scottsdale named the Garcias, who had been looking for a summer place on the lake. By all accounts, decent people who had done nothing wrong except trust a listing that should never have existed. I made my decision on a Tuesday evening, sitting in the same kitchen where David had told me about his financial trouble 3 years earlier. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and said aloud to the empty room, "The way you talk to someone who isn't there anymore, when you need to think clearly." "All right, Dorothy. I think we both know what has to happen." The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at a title company in Minnetonka. Robert made the arrangements. He spoke with the title company's legal team in advance, explained the trust structure, and confirmed that a representative of the trust me would be present on closing day. The title officer was a professional woman named Sandra who had clearly handled complicated situations before and handled this one with the same steady composure. I arrived early. Robert met me in the parking lot, the way old friends meet before difficult things, without a lot of unnecessary conversation. He asked if I was ready. I told him I thought so. He said that was usually the right answer. We waited in a small side room off the main corridor. David and Cassandra arrived at 9:45. I did not see them come in, but I heard Cassandra's voice in the hallway, the bright social occasion voice she used when she wanted to be charming. She sounded confident. She sounded like a woman who believed the next 2 hours would end with a cashier's check and a new chapter. The Garcias arrived a few minutes later. The closing began. Documents were distributed. Identification was verified. The title officer began walking through the ownership chain, and that is when everything paused. I could hear the conversation through the wall of the side room. Not every word, but enough. Cassandra's voice rising slightly. David's measured, reasonable tone, trying to find the error that would explain this away. Sandra's professional steadiness. Then Sandra said, "The trust's authorized representative is present today and has requested to be part of this conversation." Robert opened the door to the conference room. I walked in. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. I had imagined it enough times over the preceding months. But what I actually felt, standing in the doorway of that room with the morning light coming through the windows and my son's face going pale across the table, was something I can only describe as a kind of sorrow that had nothing triumphant in it at all. David said, "Dad, not a question. Not a greeting, just the word. The way you say a word when your mind is trying to catch up to something it doesn't want to be true." Cassandra was very still. She had the expression of a person recalculating something quickly, running numbers, searching for the exit. The Garcias looked uncomfortable. I felt genuinely sorry for them. I took the seat that Sandra indicated, across the table from David and Cassandra. I thanked Sandra for her professionalism. Then I looked at my son. "The lake house is held in the Pittman family trust," I said. "It has been since we purchased it 11 years ago. The deed was never transferred. I am the sole trustee." The silence lasted several seconds. Cassandra said, "Walter never told us it was in a trust." She had used my name as a way of creating distance, I noticed. "Not Dad. Not even Gerald. Walter." "I never told you it wasn't," I said. "But I also know that anyone preparing to sell a property is responsible for verifying their legal ownership of it before listing it." David pressed his thumb against the inside of his wrist. He didn't seem to notice he was doing it. "We thought," he started. "I know what you thought," I said. "Your father's verbal reassurance over dinner one night wasn't a deed transfer, David. It was a hope. And you chose to treat it as paperwork." The Garcias excused themselves quietly. I didn't blame them. Robert spoke briefly with their agent in the hallway to explain the situation and confirm that their earnest money would be returned in full. They were blameless in this. I made sure that was handled properly before I said another word about anything else. When the room held only the four of us, Sandra, Robert, David, and Cassandra, I set my hands flat on the table. I wasn't angry. I want you to understand that. The anger had come and gone over the months of waiting. What was left was something quieter and more final. "The living arrangement is over," I said. I will give you 60 days to find other housing. That is reasonable, and it is more than the law requires. I will not make this harder than it needs to be." I paused. "But I need you to hear me say one thing before we leave this room." David looked up. "Those teacups belong to your mother. They belonged to her mother before that. I don't care what you do with the furniture. I don't care what you do with the dock. But Dorothy's things are not yours to sell." My voice was steady. I was proud of that. "They were never yours to sell." Something crossed David's face. I had seen that expression once before, when he was 11 and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball, and come home and told me about it before I had a chance to find out any other way. It was the expression of a person who knows they have done something wrong and has run out of ways to rationalize it. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were red. Cassandra looked at her hands. The meeting ended. Papers were gathered. Sandra closed her folders with the quiet efficiency of a person who has witnessed worse. Robert walked me to my car, and we stood in the parking lot for a moment in the October air that carried the first real chill of the approaching Minnesota winter. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I need a cup of coffee," I said. He smiled. "That sounds about right." The following weeks were strange, not dramatic. Real life after difficult things is rarely dramatic. It is mostly quiet and slow and full of small moments you don't know what to do with. I stayed in my house. I went to my Tuesday morning coffee group at the senior center, where 4 retired men and I drink bad coffee and argue about baseball and occasionally say something true by accident. I walked the 2 blocks to the frozen lake each morning. I slept better than I had in months. David and Cassandra began the process of finding a new place. Robert managed the legal details. I did not hear from Cassandra directly during those weeks. Lily called me on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the closing. She was 14 by then, and her voice had the careful steadiness of a teenager who has practiced what she wanted to say. "Grandpa." "Hi, sweetheart. Are you okay?" "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean it for a long time. She was quiet for a moment. "Mom said you were being difficult." I almost laughed. "Difficult? What do you think?" I asked. Another pause. "I think you're the person who drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm last February to come to my school play." She said it simply, the way teenagers say true things when they decide to stop being teenagers for a minute. "I think that matters." I held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything to say that would have added to that. "It matters to me too," I said finally. David appeared at my door on a Saturday morning in November, unannounced, which told me he was afraid that if he announced himself, I might say no. He had always avoided conflict through timing. I let him in, made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table like 2 people who have known each other for 42 years and still aren't sure what to say to each other after something like this. He didn't make excuses. That surprised me. I had expected excuses. Instead, he said, "I've been thinking about the garage sale for weeks." I looked at my coffee cup. "Cassandra organized it," he said, "but I knew it was happening. I didn't stop it." He set his jaw. "I didn't even think about what was in the boxes. I should have. I should have looked. Those were Mom's things, and I should have looked." Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder Dorothy had put up 15 years ago, the red feeder that I had repainted twice to keep it looking the way she liked. "You're right," I said. "You should have." He nodded. He didn't argue with that. I got so focused on what I thought we were building that I stopped paying attention to what I was losing. I thought about that for a moment. It was an honest thing to say, and honest things are worth sitting with. "Your mother used to say that people show you what they value by what they protect," I said. She meant it about possessions, but I think she meant it about people too. David looked up at me. "I needed you to protect me a little," I said. "Not from Cassandra, just to remember that I was still your father and not a problem to be solved." His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them, which was new. David had always wiped them. "I know," he said. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about the house, not about logistics, not about who did what. We talked about Dorothy. We talked about the lake house in its early years. The summer we drove up together and found a family of foxes had denned under the porch. For the winter, his mother slipped on the ice at the end of the dock and came inside furious and laughing at the same time. We talked about the years when David was small and the world was simpler. I can't tell you that conversation fixed anything, because that isn't how trust works. Trust is not repaired by a single good conversation any more than a bridge is rebuilt by a single good day of work. But something started. Something that had been frozen began, very slowly, to thaw. The lake house sold the following spring to a family from Iowa. Legitimate sale, clean title, nobody surprised at the closing table. I used a portion of the proceeds to set up education accounts for Lily and for Cassandra and David's younger child, a son named Marcus, who had just turned 4. I did not announce this as generosity. I had Robert handle the paperwork and send them notice through the mail. David called to thank me. I told him the money was for the children and asked how Marcus was sleeping. He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and told me Marcus had decided that 3 in the morning was an excellent time for conversation. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and it was one of the better phone calls we had ever had. Cassandra's apology came in a letter, which I respected. She could have texted, or had David deliver the message, or said nothing at all. Instead, she sat down and wrote it out by hand on actual stationery and mailed it to my house. Her handwriting was unexpectedly careful, the handwriting of a person who had taken time. She wrote that she understood she had treated me as an obstacle and not as a person. She wrote that she was sorry about Dorothy's things. She wrote that she couldn't undo it, which was true, and that she didn't expect forgiveness to be immediate, which was also true. I read the letter twice, then I put it in the drawer where I keep things I want to remember. I did not move to the lake or buy a smaller house or make any dramatic changes. I stayed in the same house where Dorothy and I had raised David, where the blue curtains still hang in the bedroom and the cross-stitch is still on the wall and the crossword books are still on the nightstand. I painted the front porch that summer. I started going to a weekly fly fishing group on Saturday mornings that meets at a sporting goods store and drinks terrible coffee and argues about lures the same way my Tuesday group argues about baseball. I laughed at a joke in October that caught me off guard, and I noticed that I laughed and I let myself. This past Christmas, David brought his family to my house for dinner. Cassandra brought a dish she had made from scratch, which she placed on the counter and didn't make a production of, which I thought was exactly right. Lily sat at the kitchen table with a book while I finished the roast, the same way she used to on Saturday mornings, and at one point she looked up and said, "Grandpa, do you think the butler actually did it?" And I said, "They always think it's the butler," and she grinned. Marcus wanted to help set the table and managed to drop 2 forks and a serving spoon in the first 5 minutes, which seemed about right for a 4-year-old. David caught the serving spoon and set it in the sink and caught my eye across the kitchen, and neither of us said anything, but something passed between us that was old and real and quietly glad to still exist. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Marcus was asleep on the sofa, and Lily had retreated to the guest room with her book, and Cassandra was quietly putting away the last of the leftovers, David came and stood beside me on the front porch. The night was clear and cold the way Minnesota nights are in December, sharp enough that your breath is visible and the stars look closer than they have any right to be. We stood there for a few minutes without saying anything. Then David said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I know I keep saying it." "You can keep saying it," I said. "It doesn't wear out." He nodded. He looked out at the street, at the houses with their lights and their ordinary evenings happening inside. "I thought I knew what I was doing," he said. "I thought I was being smart about the future." "You were thinking about the future," I said. "You just forgot who else lives in it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to try to do better," he said. I looked at my son standing beside me in the December cold, the same son who once fell asleep in my lap during a Twins game, and who cried at his mother's funeral, and who sat across from me at the kitchen table, with his thumb pressed against his wrist, telling me he didn't know what he was going to do. The same son who handed me a closing document with my name on the wrong side of it, and somehow convinced himself that was all right. People are more than the worst thing they've ever done. I believe that. I have to believe that, or else there isn't much point in any of this. "I know you will," I said, and I meant it, not because he had earned it yet, but because love is not a transaction, and family is not a property that gets transferred when you stop paying attention. Some things you hold on to and trust not for yourself, but for the people who come after you, and for the ones who came before. Dorothy understood that. She understood it better than I ever did. I still talk to her sometimes, in the quiet of the house after everyone has gone home. I tell her about Lily's books and Marcus's chaos and the cardinal on the red feeder and the way David laughed on the phone that day in a way I hadn't heard in years. And I imagine she smiles. The way she used to smile at something just outside the frame. If you've ever felt like the people closest to you forgot to see you, if you've ever given something quietly and watched it taken for granted, I hope this reminds you that your worth does not depend on their recognition of it. Hold your ground gently. Take care of yourself seriously, and don't sell anything that belongs to your mother. Thank you for sitting with me today. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment, share your own experience, or simply let me know you were here. And if stories about family, honesty, and finding your way back to yourself are what you're looking for, stay with us. There's always another one waiting. Sometimes the people we love the most forget to see us not out of cruelty, but out of carelessness. And the quiet, painful work of staying true to yourself anyway, of not shrinking to make others comfortable, of holding the door open even when you'd be justified in closing it, that is its own kind of love. If Gerald's story teaches anything, it's this. Your dignity is not something anyone else can take. You only give it away when you stop insisting on it. A small note for you, this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted for your entertainment and to share a small, honest lesson about the kind of love that holds its ground with grace.